Hello. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Feel free to continue getting your food and come on in. Happy first week of classes to everybody. We're really excited today to have Ralph Izzo, the chairman and CEO of PSEG, which is a New Jersey utility just up the road. He's here to talk to us about his climate strategy entitled 5 Ways to Tackle Climate Change. Before I give him an introduction, I just want to acknowledge we have a few different groups of people in the room and also videoing in. We're really happy and privileged to have St. Luke's School here from New Canaan, who as part of their J-term, they actually have a week of no classes where they can focus on a contemporary issue, and I guess this year is climate change. So thank you to Eric and YPCCC for bringing them in. We also have 75 students from Yale's Certificate on Financing and Deploying Clean Energy, which have dialed in remotely. And most of you, I think, are from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, like myself. Thank you to the Energy Specialization for helping fund and sponsor this event. A couple things about Ralph. Ralph is here to discuss, as I said, his climate strategy entitled 5 Ways to Tackle Climate Change. He's a well-known leader in the utility industry, as well as the public policy arena. He's frequently been asked to testify before Congress. Afterwards, after this talk, we downstairs from 1:30 to 3:30 in the C-Bay conference room. Some members, Ralph will be there, and some members of his recruitment team will be there to talk about career opportunities and also provide an opportunity for more one-on-one discussion with Ralph and his colleagues about anything said. We'll have some time for questions at the end of the presentation, but without further ado, please join me in welcoming CEO Ralph Izzo.
Hey, thank you, Jesse. So just quick questions. Anyone in the audience from New Jersey, full-time, any? Ever heard of PSEG? Okay. So just by way of a little bit of an intro, PSEG is one of the 10 largest electric and gas utilities in the nation. There are about 100 such companies who make that claim. And the reason why we do that is that everybody uses a different measuring stick for being the largest, as you could well imagine. I am joined today with two colleagues. I have Karen Cleve, our Vice President of Communications, and Jim Namioka, our Director of Communications, who are with me as well. So our company has a vision for the future that is highly informed by the topic I want to speak about. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about that vision. That vision calls for a future in which customers use as little energy as they need to use to achieve whatever lifestyle outcomes they want to achieve. That the energy they do use is cleaner than it's ever been before, and that it's delivered with an unparalleled degree of reliability and resiliency. And as I said, the topic that I wish to spend some time with you on today is climate change, and that does inform much of that 3-part strategy of using less, using cleaner, and having it be more reliable than ever before. Now, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change commissioned by the United Nations, and their targets for what carbon emission reductions needed to be to achieve a 1.5 degree C rise in global temperatures by 2030. In fact, even at that level of change, there are some significant shifts that take place in our global ecosystem, and in fact will affect socioeconomic systems in terms of changes in climate that result in changes of what can and cannot grow in certain areas and how the biosystem will need to adjust. The Paris Accord, which you hear spoken about quite a bit, targets a set of reductions that would achieve a 3 degree C change in global climate temperatures. So gone are the aspirations to achieve that 1.5 degree C change. And in fact, if you look at the progress we need to make to achieve somewhere between 1.5 and 3 degrees C, we are not on track to achieve that. While in 2018, and the data just came out for 2019, the U.S. did realize reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The rest of the planet did not, and in fact, the sum of the two was such that global climate-related gases did increase. In 2019, the data for the U.S. is in, and the U.S. did realize a 2.9% decline in carbon emissions, but I don't have the data for global emissions at this point in time. So the title of the presentation is 5 things being a very technical term, that we need to do to achieve climate change mitigation. And it really is an all-of-the-above approach, which is something that is quite familiar to those of us in the energy industry. For the first century of electricity generation and distribution, my industry relied on a variety of technologies to make sure that universal access to electricity was realized. So coal was utilized, natural gas was used, nuclear power was used, small power plants were developed, large power plants were developed, sophisticated high voltage grids were put in place to be able to transport central station power to faraway places. Underground systems for distribution in urban areas were developed, and so on and so on and so on. So too, to tackle as complicated a challenge as climate change, I believe that we need to take an all-the-above approach, but I'll highlight 5 major areas that could constitute such an approach as we talk over the next few moments. And by the way, Jesse was kind enough to remind you that questions are welcome at the end, but I would modify that to say questions are welcome as I go along. If there's something that I say that piques your interest or maybe you disagree with, please don't hesitate for a moment to raise the subject. But we're going to walk through a price on carbon, the importance of renewable energy, the importance of nuclear power, the value of energy efficiency, and then the electrification of transportation as our 5 topics. Let's talk a little bit first, though, about one of the biggest challenges to implementing a strategy to combat climate change, and that's the cost associated with minimizing or eliminating CO2 emissions. We've had a benefit in this nation over the past few years that I suspect many of you are familiar with, and that is the technological advances that have allowed us to access natural gas in our shale geologies. Prior to probably 20 years ago, most of our natural gas and oil were the result of explorations in deep wells. And if I can describe the complexity of that in very, very simple terms, imagine that I had a cup of a fluid here, perhaps it was a cup of coffee, and somewhere from the ceiling one had to drill, knowing full well that there was this liquid that was very valuable in my cup, and one had to get it right and get that drill right in that cup. So a fairly expensive process, one informed by science, but one not guaranteed by science to have that drill hit that cup right here. Now imagine that instead of having this cup of coffee here, I spill the coffee and get it on this desk, and in fact the desk that's probably 10 times larger. And I still have to drill from that ceiling to get down to this desk to access the coffee. A much easier task, not guaranteed to certainly allow you to reach the pot of gold, so to speak, at the bottom of the drill tip. This improvement in technology was called often horizontal drilling. Nowadays, it's gotten a slightly different tag associated with it, known as fracking, often with a very negative connotation associated with it. The result of that technological advance has been a decline in electricity prices because, by and large, the marginal cost of electricity is determined by natural gas power plants. So here I'm just showing 2 simple lines. We could have made this graph much more complicated. PJM used to stand for Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland. It now represents 13 states plus the District of Columbia, so the letters don't mean as much anymore. But it is the largest competitive power pool in the United States, and arguably one of the, if not the largest in the world. So it has a liquid hub where people buy and sell electricity in a standard product, and it's called the PJM West Hub. And at that hub, therefore, there's a futures market where you can buy and sell electricity not only today, but you can buy and sell it tomorrow, a year from now, 2 years from now, and 3 years from now. The liquidity at that hub drops precipitously once you get past about 2 years, but nonetheless, there is an actively traded product. So here all we've plotted is what the prediction for electricity prices were at the PJM West Hub back in September of 18 and then in September of 19. And what you can see on the yellow line is that the price was expected to decline over the next few years. And in fact, when we moved the year forward, prices were still expected to decline, but they're expected to decline even further than the prior year prediction. In fact, if I were to show this type of a slide for the predictions that have taken place over the past 15 years, you would see the exact same trend, that the expectations were for power prices to go down, but they went down even more than was expected. And the reason for that is simply that that fracking process that I've described for you has become ever more sophisticated. And in fact, it's no longer considered an exploration process at all. It's really basically a manufacturing process in terms of extracting natural gas from the region. However, natural gas, despite the fact that it's much cleaner than the prior workhorse of the fleet, that being coal, is still a carbon emitter. So step number one, I believe, is to put a price on carbon. Now, you can call that whatever you like, because there are various mechanisms by which one can achieve a price on carbon. One could use carbon taxes, where you simply look at the BTU content of a fuel and see how much carbon is in that fuel by mass, and establish a price that you therefore tax any user of that fuel. There are other methodologies that are less common in terms of our vernacular, but one in particular that is my favorite is something called a cap and trade system, whereby people have to purchase the right to emit carbon through some type of a certificate, and that certificate becomes a tradable item. We could talk in greater detail on that if there's an interest in it. There are implicit prices on carbon that one could impart to the industry by simply saying, thou shalt not use fill in the blank, some carbon emitting fuel, or thou shalt use fill in the blank, some technology that doesn't emit carbon. And by simply mandating that through some regulatory system, you impart an implied price on carbon. And we'll spend a little bit more time talking about that and the economic inefficiency it creates. Now, there are a lot of estimates about the value of reducing carbon emissions into the atmosphere. I tend to focus on a report that was done by the National Academies of Sciences, which was more of a survey study. So I think that there was very little original research in that analysis in 2017, but the National Academy convened a group of experts and said, okay, let's look at the research that's been done on this subject and come up with a social cost of carbon. How much should we be willing to spend today to not emit a ton of carbon, because its impact is going to be multiple. Sea level rise, changes in climate, changes in economic consequences in certain regions. The price that the National Academy came up with was $30 per ton and $2007. We've simply applied a 3% discount factor and brought that to $2018, which is $50 per ton. So in general, the best thinking we have in the nation from experts says that we should be willing to spend up to $50 a ton to not emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Today, there is no explicit price on carbon, so power markets are not designed with this in mind, but there are a variety of mechanisms that seek to eliminate or reduce the amount of carbon that we emit, and I'll talk about them each in turn. Now, why does this matter? Well, let's just take a look at two technologies. Let's take a look at a natural gas plant, which emits about half a ton of carbon for every megawatt hour it generates, and a nuclear plant. The way in which power markets operate in PJM, which again is a very large and important market, this is not the way they operate around the country, is that power plants are called upon to supply electricity based on their short-run marginal costs. What is the incremental cost of producing the next megawatt hour? The economic theory behind that is if I own a power plant and I can collect that amount of money at least, then I'm incented to operate my plant, because anything above and beyond that is a contribution to my fixed or my sunk costs. Now, I'm cheating a little bit on this slide, and I will confess to that right here and now, that I am comparing the short-run marginal cost of a gas plant, which is that $13 per megawatt hour, to the full variable cost of a nuclear plant. If I were just to compare fuel to fuel, then I would compare $13 to $8, and the nuclear plant looks more economic. But here what I've done is I've said the labor costs in a gas plant are basically zero. You typically need about 20 people to run a gas plant. You need about 1,000 people to run a nuclear plant. So I've included the labor costs here as a variable component of the cost structure. The reality is if a nuclear plant doesn't run one day, you don't send those people home. So that's not the economic basis on which nuclear is dispatched. But I've not included the sunk costs for either. So the metal, the concrete, whatever it costs to build the asset. So to run a nuclear plant today and to pay for the people at the site, you need $32 per megawatt hour. To run a gas plant and pay for the fuel and the people at the site, you need $13 per megawatt hour. Gas plants win. And in fact, nuclear plants are retiring around the country despite the fact that there's zero carbon emitters. Now, if I conclude that that gas plant is producing half a ton of carbon, and I take the National Academy's point of view that that's costing society half of the $50, then I would add a $25 price on carbon, and the nuclear plant would be the winner. Now, there's all sorts of other factors that one might argue should be applied here. What about high-level waste costs? What about for the nuclear plant? What about NOx costs for the gas plant? What about safety costs for the nuclear plant? I would argue that those are implied already in the cost because each of those aspects of the operation of those facilities is regulated. NOx is regulated. High-level waste storage and disposal is regulated. We could argue about whether or not they're suitably regulated and fully embedded in the cost, and that's an entire different topic. But CO2 is not regulated in either of the two, and therefore a legitimate cost to impose upon the gas plant. So a price on carbon could be a measuring stick by which we make more rational decisions about what our supply options should be, and it should be done, I would argue, on a national level. Actually, it should be done on an international level, but I spend most of my time just trying to get the nation to pay attention to this. So let's talk about one of the most important things we can do to combat climate change, and that's to invest in renewable energy. Now, fortunately, many states are taking an active role in developing and encouraging nuclear energy. And in fact, the public, when you ask them, are they in favor of renewable energy, you get about a 90% favorability rating on solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind. The reality is that the public is not well informed on the importance and the cost associated with renewable energy, and oftentimes don't recognize that while the wind and the sun are free, that converting them to electricity is not. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. That just means that we should have an informed public about what the costs associated with it are. Let's just take one specific example of solar energy in New Jersey. So you see here in New Jersey, there is a regulatory mechanism. We can get into the specifics of it if there's interest. But for now, let me just refer to it as an SREC, Solar Renewable Energy Credit. It's a payment stream that the owner of a solar asset receives in New Jersey, and right now that payment stream is about $230 per megawatt hour. The only way you can generate it is by having a solar panel and a solar farm and a solar producing asset. And its value is derived from the fact that New Jersey requires a certain amount of its electricity come from solar. None of us would ask for an SREC for our birthday present or for a Christmas present or a holiday present. There's no intrinsic value to the consumer to an SREC. It's purely a regulatory construct used to subsidize solar. So if you think about that SREC, it is displacing a megawatt hour of electricity that would come from PJM otherwise. And if you look at the carbon intensity of PJM and say, okay, well, what am I displacing? You're displacing some combination of wind from Pennsylvania, of nuclear from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, of coal from Western Pennsylvania, and natural gas from everywhere. You blend all that together, and you come out with slightly better than half a ton of carbon per megawatt hour, which results, therefore, in a carbon mitigation price of just shy of $400 per ton, almost a factor of 8 higher than what the National Academy of Sciences says we should be doing. In fact, when we poll New Jersey residents and ask them, how much would you be willing to spend on renewable energy, you get some grumpy people who say not a penny. And then you get most of the population, the vast majority of the population of our customers who say they would be willing to spend up to $6 per megawatt hour to support renewable energy for themselves. What would your guess be that New Jersey residents are paying to support renewable energy for others? If they're willing to spend up to $6 for themselves, presumably you would expect them to be willing to spend something less than $6 for others. Nowadays in New Jersey, they're paying $7 for others. Now, why would someone say that I don't want to spend more than $6 for myself and be willing to spend $7 for others? You don't tell them. They don't know that they're spending $7 for others. It's not on the bill in any explicit way because that's the regulatory system under which we operate. And I think that can come back to bite us over the long term because we're doing a good thing. We're just doing too much of it at too high a cost. So what should we do? Well, let's turn our attention to offshore wind. Recently, New Jersey was one of several states that announced the solicitation and, in fact, building 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind. I know we're doing that in Connecticut and Massachusetts and other states. New Jersey had, in its solicitation, the second lowest price for offshore wind of any state. The only price that was lower was a project up in Massachusetts. And that price is $98 per megawatt hour. If you go through the same analysis as what I mentioned before, and you back out what this is displacing, you find that the price here is more like $100 to $140 a ton, a lot less expensive than solar and therefore trending in the right direction. And this is a good thing, I would argue. That contract price will escalate by 2% per year. So depending upon whether or not that power price trajectory continues, this subsidy will grow larger and larger, right? Because you saw the PJM West price was coming down in future years, yet this contract has an escalation in it. By the way, I'm not picking on anybody when I say this. My company is the largest solar owner of solar power in New Jersey, and we are possibly a 25% owner of this offshore wind project. So these high prices that customers are paying are coming to my company. So just to make a point here that I'm not taking shots at other folks. Now, so the good news is that this is 1/4 the price of solar. The bad news is it's still 2 times more expensive than the National Academy said. The other challenge is that solar is done typically 1 rooftop at a time. Offshore wind is done 1 gigawatt at a time. So it's taken 15 years for New Jerseyans to run up a bill of $600 million a year in solar subsidies. The very first year this comes online, the bill will be $350 million a year in offshore wind subsidies. So thus the value of carbon in pointing out where it makes sense to build renewables. Because these economics I gave you are true of New Jersey. They're not true of Arizona for solar. They're not true of Montana for wind. They're true of Connecticut for solar and wind. They're true of Massachusetts for solar and wind. So you have this dislocation where your population centers tend to not be where the resource is richest. So you do need to look at government policy about the construction of where these renewables should be built and then the mechanism for bringing the supply to the load centers, which would largely be transmission. So again, with the price on carbon, we would be making more rational economic decisions about this very important solution to climate change called renewable energy. In the absence of that, we have some pretty bizarre decisions being made. As I mentioned a moment ago, you have this phenomenally rich solar renewable energy credit being paid to solar developers to justify the economic cost associated with building that solar farm. That has another negative effect. If you think back a moment ago to what I said about the way in which PJM dispatches power plants, it does it on short-run marginal costs. What is the short-run marginal cost of a wind farm or a solar farm? It's 0. At that point, the fuel is free. So what is a very expensive alternative in certain parts of the country looks like a free alternative to the market. And that puts further pressure above and beyond the pressure of natural gas on other equally carbon-free sources of electricity, such as nuclear. In fact, if you look at New Jersey, you'll find that even though nuclear only accounts for about 35–40% of the electricity in the state, it's 90% of the carbon-free energy in the state. If you look at this statistic nationwide, you'll find that nuclear represents about 20% of the nation's electricity, but 50% of its carbon-free energy. Yet I believe 7 plants have retired in the past few years, and about 12 are at risk of retiring. Absent a national price on carbon that would keep these carbon-free sources of electricity available to us, states have had to step in. States like Illinois, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey have done things to keep their existing nuclear fleet online. In New Jersey, what we did is we created something called a zero-emission certificate. That is a subsidy of $10 per megawatt hour. Do the same analysis as before and look at what it would have been replaced by in PJM, and that turns into a price of about $17 per metric ton. well below what the National Academy says we should be paying to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. And I couldn't tell if that was a hand being raised or an itchy back. Was it just okay? We'll leave it there. So if in fact the 12 nuclear plants that are at risk of retiring were to retire, they would literally wipe out the carbon-free emissions that resulted nationwide from all of the solar farms that were put in place as of 2018. And you see this pattern being repeated in other places. You've seen this in Germany, you've seen this in California, whereby in the interest of climate change, what has been done is heavy investments in renewable energy, great, but out of other public policy concerns, the retirement of nuclear, which tends to counteract the benefits of the renewables. So I would suggest that in addition to investing in renewables, preserving our existing nuclear fleet is an essential component of combating climate change. As someone with a nuclear background, I would argue that in fact R&D in renewables and in nuclear would be something that the country would be well advised to invest in going forward, in the hopes that we can make systems passively safe, and I do believe that's possible, and in fact smaller and more modular that would facilitate investment decisions as it pertains to nuclear. So a price on carbon would help us decide whether to invest in renewables or nuclear or both or neither, or to do some in one place and some in another. But perhaps my favorite topic in combating climate change is the one that gets the least attention, and I just don't understand why that's the case. And that would be energy efficiency. In fact, energy efficiency is the only thing I will be able to present to you today where we can combat climate change and lower the customer's bill. Every other solution we have will raise the customer's bill, some less than what is justified by the National Academy, some more than what's justified by the National Academy. But only energy efficiency can do it while reducing the bill. And I'm not talking about overly sophisticated technology here. I am talking about people caulking their windows. I am talking about folks using the programmability in their thermostat to change the temperature at night when they go to bed versus the daytime when they're awake, to change the temperature on that thermostat when they leave the house to go to work versus when they're home on the weekend, to change that incandescent light bulb that our grandparents used for that LED bulb that is so much more energy efficient. Now, it's not that we haven't done a bunch of this. In fact, if I look at the history of energy efficiency in the country, mostly achieved through appliance standards, a study has been done that suggests that we have saved the equivalent of 313 coal-fired power plants since 1990. Now, we're picking on coal plants. That could have been any power plant, but suffice to say that we've done well through appliance efficiency standards and some utility programs that have put in place. In fact, in New Jersey, we've looked at programs that would allow us to save energy and dwarf the amount of expense that's associated with the investment opportunities, largely because New Jersey has some very old housing stock. And it's odd to me that often the states that are the most aggressive in renewables are the states that should be far more aggressive in energy efficiency. I keep picking on my home state because that's the one I'm most familiar with, but please don't feel too smug, because I am sure I could find a story for each and every one of the states that you are from that could be comparable to this. So New Jersey, for example, is 7th in the nation in installed solar capacity. Now, New Jersey has many wonderful things. We have Bruce Springsteen, we have the shore, but we don't have sun. So being 7th in the nation in solar installed capacity is crazy. In fact, I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, so this one hasn't been done by a thoroughly vetted study. I think we're 32nd in the nation in terms of the efficiency of those solar farms. I know we're 10th out of the top 10 in the nation in terms of the efficiency of those solar farms, which just means we don't get a lot of sun, because we put those panels on rooftops that were not designed to optimize solar energy conversion. Those houses were built to optimize access to the street or view of the fields or view of whatever the case might be in that particular part of the state. Similarly, New Jersey is now number 2 in its offshore wind aspirations. That's actually something that is wise from the point of view of having access to the resource, albeit the prices are pretty high right now. But there is no reason why, given our housing stock and the age of our infrastructure that we should be 34th in the nation for electric energy efficiency. One of the areas, if there are any data scientists here and you have any entrepreneurial bent, our industry is one that is ripe for someone with that background to come in and simply have a phenomenal impact. If you think about the way in which you fuel your vehicles, you see the price as it's fueling up. Well, the way in which most of us bill our customers is that we simply send you a love note once a month and shock you to death, depending upon the month. You have no means of actually understanding how much electricity you're using as the month goes on. Advanced metering infrastructure is something that has the potential to change that, but right now it's not being used in any meaningful way to help customers understand their real-time use of power. It's being used to help utilities avoid the cost of sending a human being out to read a meter or to know when customers are interrupted because a tree has fallen on the wire outside their house or something of that effect. However, I do think that with the advances in advanced metering infrastructure, we are actually able to identify customer consumption patterns in whatever brief increment that we have an interest in collecting the data. It could be every 5 minutes, it could be every 5 seconds. And the ability then to normalize the data to see how major appliances in the home are losing their capability, are losing their efficiency, are getting old and deteriorating, can help customers make some economic choices about when to retire that refrigerator, when to retire that air conditioner, and not pay the penalty associated with its inefficiency in the form of a utility bill. I know that because a few years ago, our 15-year-old air conditioning didn't seem to be doing its job, and my wife complained to me about it, and I paid no attention to her, which is a very dangerous thing to do. And then a year later, it seemed to do even worse, and I still paid no attention to her. And she said, "You work for the power company. Can you please have somebody look at the air conditioning unit?" And sure enough, I didn't get around to doing it. And then 2 years later, when it died on a very hot July day, we finally changed it and suffered the inconvenience of a few days without air conditioning and saw our electric bill plummet. This actually happened about 5 years ago, and every summer she reminds me of my stupidity and not paying attention to her, of course. So that's something that we could do that would be beneficial to customers. So energy efficiency really is, in my mind, one of the most significant, if not the most significant thing we can do to help achieve carbon reductions and free up that renewable energy to do something that is also often talked about, which is to electrify the rest of the economy. All right, so if you think about the targets we need to achieve to mitigate climate change, electricity generation used to be the #1 cause of carbon emissions. That is no longer the case as we've moved for economic reasons from a coal-heavy system to a natural gas-heavy system, having nothing to do with climate change, right? Just shale gas, inexpensive, becomes the fuel of choice. What's happened is now the #1 source of carbon emissions is no longer power production, it's transportation. Just modestly more. I think transportation accounts for about 29% of carbon emissions and electricity 28%. But electricity used to be closer to 40%. And that reduction as a result of shale gas has displaced us, has allowed us to be replaced by transportation as the #1 source of carbon emissions. Now, New Jersey, that has been the case for many, many years because New Jersey is so nuclear dependent. Transportation for a long time has been the #1 source of carbon emissions in the state. So the game plan on the part of most climate scientists is, okay, we can control electricity production. Let's make that as carbon-free as possible. Some companies like ours have made a pledge that we would like to be a net zero emitter of carbon by 2050. We know how to get to 80% reduction. We don't know how to get to that last 20%. We'll need some help from public policy in the form of price on carbon that will then motivate some folks to come up with new and innovative ways to either capture carbon or make renewables more efficient or make nuclear smaller and modular or to have energy efficiency be even less expensive. But that last 20% is going to be a challenge. So if we could decarbonize the power sector to the tune of 80% reduction or net zero, then what we can do is use electricity to power the rest of the economy, beginning with transportation. As I mentioned a moment ago, right now, transportation being #1, energy efficiency being #2, industrial processes, home heating, things of that nature are also things that we'll have to tackle and can be tackled by a carbon-free electric source. Agricultural sources of carbon emissions are a little bit tougher and don't lend themselves to a power supply option. But let's talk about electric transportation. What you'll see is that there are some states that are incredibly ripe for electric vehicles. I would argue that a state like New Jersey, high population density, short commuting distances, typically number 2 or number 3 in the nation in per capita income, poor air quality, unsophisticated mass transit system, should be a perfect set of circumstances for electric vehicle penetration. Yet we are not. In fact, I think we're among the lowest. We are actually the lowest among the 11 states that have pledged to encourage and incentivize electric vehicles in the state. And the reason for that basically is this phenomenon I'm sure you're all familiar with called range anxiety. When I get in my car, will I be able to come back from whatever my destination is? And I know that I can just go to a gas station and fill up over a matter of minutes and not have that issue. But if I want to take a trip with my electric vehicle, will I need 12 hours to charge it just because I wasn't paying enough attention, or because it's colder out and my battery life died a lot more quickly than I expected it to? So those issues and challenges remain in a state like New Jersey. Other states that have taken the lead in this regard, in particular California, have done some really smart things. They've basically encouraged their utilities to build out the infrastructure to allow the market to begin to take hold. So once the infrastructure for recharging gets built, then you do have more people buying electric vehicles. Once more people buy electric vehicles, then you have other entrants to the market who are willing to build out the infrastructure to then make it even easier to get that fast charge at just about any location. So electrifying transportation would be step number 5 to help further reduce carbon going forward. Now, the theme, though, here really has been an all-of-the-above approach. And to think about ways in which we've tackled complicated problems, I would just direct your attention back to one particular topic that was in the transportation world. So in 1971, almost 60,000 people died every year in America from automobile accidents. Almost 60,000 people. And by the way, at that point in time, we didn't have 330 million Americans. We had 230 million Americans. Now that number's been reduced still to too high a number, but it's 30,000. It's been cut in half. And it's been done through a variety of measures. It's been done through education as to the importance of not drinking and driving. That we drill that into our children from the very earliest age. The importance of wearing safety belts. So there's been some cultural, educational things that have done to modify our habits. There have been advances in technology in the form of anti-lock brakes, in the form of airbags. And there have been important changes in shifts in our behavior that communication technologies allow us to not spend as much time behind the wheel. So that all-of-the-above approach has worked in that case. It's worked in cancer treatments. It's worked in so many of our intractable problems that we've had to tackle as a society, that I think the existential threat posed by climate change fits that same exact description. So that price on carbon gives us the measuring stick to then choose among the many tools, some of which are right in some areas but not right in other areas, be that renewables, be that wind, be that solar, be that energy efficiency, be that nuclear power. And then with the reduced demand for current use of electricity, the increase in supply of carbon-free electricity, the ability to then decarbonize the rest of the economy by powering it with the electric grid is something that I think will position us to make some effort at reducing that inevitable climate impact that we seem headlong determined to thrust upon future generations. So with that, I'll stop. And as I warned Jesse, no matter how many times I invite people to ask questions during the course of the presentation, it never happens. And now there'll be this long pregnant pause before the first question, and then we'll get one and it'll open the floodgates. So please prove me wrong. There we go. Excellent. Okay.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for the presentation. So I know you mentioned that a lot of the energy efficiency side, a lot of the other things to tackle climate change involve increasing rates on people. And with in the United States, we're seeing an increase of energy poverty, such that people, low-income people, are spending more of their income on their energy bills. So how do you reconcile that with combating climate change?
Yeah, so that's why I would do energy efficiency first and foremost. So over the past 15 years, our company has invested on average $3 billion a year, basically on an aging infrastructure that needed replacement and mitigating the effects of climate change. New Jersey being one of the original 13 colonies, most of our industry was developed along rail corridors, waterways, low-lying areas that we've had to make massive improvements because of for climate adaptation. $3 billion a year. Over that same period of time, we've invested $2 billion over 15 years, not per year, in solar energy. We are on the verge of investing $1 billion in offshore wind. Over that same period of time, we've invested $40 million per year in energy efficiency. And you are spot on. If you look at the market imperfections associated with energy efficiency, they are most egregious for lower income people. You go into, so I test our power markets as a consumer. Obviously, there sometimes can be a bias if people recognize who I am. But we had a washer dryer collapse on us, and we went to our appliance store to buy suitable alternatives. And we could have gotten items for a couple $100 each. And of course you need them, and if you don't want to go to the laundromat, that's what you would do. Or we could have paid twice as much to buy energy efficient appliance and get a $150 rebate on those energy efficiency appliances. I found it incredulous. My salary is public information. I don't mean to be obnoxious or arrogant about it, but I am the last person in the world who should be eligible for rebates. So I thought this can't be right. So the salesman, not knowing who I was, said, just fill out this one pager and you'll get it. Sure enough, we filled out the one pager, and a $150 check showed up at my home later on. A low-income person contributed to that $150 payment and could not afford to buy that high-efficiency appliance despite the rebate. So our proposal to the state of New Jersey has been, we want to target low-income customers. We want to target schools, hospitals, facilities that everyone benefits from through their property tax rates. You would not believe the challenges we've had getting approval to do that. We filed as recently as January of 2019, 14 months ago, to take that $40 million a year to $400 million a year. So a $2.5 billion investment over 6 years to target those affected populations, because they cannot make that upfront capital investment that they need to make. And to your point earlier, if you look at utility bills as a percentage of disposable income, it's much higher for low-income groups than it is for high-income groups, and yet it's the high-income group that can afford the energy efficiency. It's frustrating. We have a phenomenal governor in New Jersey. His name is Phil Murphy. He is so excited about combating climate change, but there is this desire to do the groundbreaking for the solar farm. There is this desire to stand on the port and talk about the offshore wind. And it's just not as glamorous to talk about that programmable thermostat. I have gone to the homes of our energy efficiency customers, the ones we've supported for $40 million a year. You would not believe the quality of the housing stock. It is atrocious. I mean, you might as well just have a screened house instead of a wood house in terms of the intrusion of the outside air, heat in the summer, cold in the winter. Yeah, you hit a hot button for me. You're spot on. What we need is regulatory reform that allows us to provide universal access to energy efficiency for customers, as opposed to the asinine grant-based programs that provide regressive subsidies. And it doesn't stop with energy efficiency. Remember what I said before about $7 versus $6 for solar energy? So there are 3 subsidies to solar energy customers in New Jersey. One is the federal investment tax credit. Second is the solar renewable energy credit that I mentioned. And third is something called net metering. I won't bore you with the details of that. Those subsidies are paid for by the average American taxpayer, the federal tax credit. That person earns about $55,000 a year. The second and third subsidies paid for by the average New Jersey, and the average New Jerseyan earns about $70,000 per year. The average rooftop solar owner, $115,000 a year. Also highly regressive programs. So sometimes in our enthusiasm for doing these things, we just don't realize the socioeconomic implications for it. And we're trying real hard to correct for that, but we have a long way to go. Yes.
Is PSEG lobbying for price on carbon?
Yes, actively. I was just in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee of the House of Representatives on October 28th, I think it was, where I said we need a price on carbon to be able to make these decisions more rationally. I spent probably half of my time back 11 years ago when a cap and trade bill that was being pushed by Misters Waxman and Markey from Massachusetts, Waxman from California, in favor of a price on carbon. That was through a cap and trade system, as I said a moment ago. We did get it through the House. It died in the Senate. Candidly, it died from fatigue from the Affordable Care Act. We were following close on the heels of that. We had the full support of President Obama, but we just couldn't get the votes in the Senate. So we lobby actively for a price on carbon. Yes?
Under your transportation strategy, is PSEG partnering with local governments around electrifying public transportation?
Yes, I'm sorry. So modestly so. What we do is we've installed charging stations at our company facilities, and I think we've installed a handful. It's a number like 40 or so at other locations where there are fleets. But we have not rolled out a large program. We have, as part of our request, you have to understand, regulated utilities cannot tie their shoes without asking regulators for permission. That's obviously an exaggeration. So as part of that, in addition to that $2.5 billion program I mentioned before, we've asked regulators to allow us to invest $300 million for charging stations up and down the major transportation corridors of the state, but that's still pending their consideration. Questions? Well, okay, if not, I thank you for joining us today. And as Jesse mentioned, we will have a couple of folks downstairs just talking about employment opportunities with PSEG, and I'm more than happy to spend some time with you down there if there's an interest in chatting further. Thank you. Have a great day, folks.